All right, we are live. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope your holidays have been well. I hope everybody is staying inside in these cold, wet, rainy weather that I'm in. And hopefully the weather's good where you're at. We're going to talk about the book of Daniel today. I have obviously an expert in particular on this subject that's joining us, Dr. John J. Collins. He is absolutely an expert on apocalyptic literature. That's without a doubt. He has studied the book of Daniel well over 40 years in particular. And he's going to be hanging out with me and my good friend, Jonathan Sheffield, today. We're going to have a discussion examining the book of Daniel and how people are looking at it, etc. So first thing I want to do is I want to promote. That's what I do. I want everybody to go and check out Dr. John J. Collins' books. I have a lot of them right here in front of me. I feel pretty privileged. A couple of them, he has even written notes in them. So when he's long gone, I have some legendary books here in my bookshelf. So go check out John J. Collins' works. He is a professor, Hebrew Bible. He was at Yale University. Is it Yale Divinity, Dr. Collins?
Yep.
Yale Divinity for many
That's
years.
part of Yale University.
And you retired just recently. Yes, sir. So I hope everybody goes to check out the works. This is how you learn. You study the works and you go and get the books and learn a thing or two. Jonathan Sheffield has an amazing YouTube channel as well as my really good friend. Go subscribe. I really mean that. Interfaith dialogue, all of these conversations are wonderful. We love exploring these things. And finally, my Patreon. If you're interested in joining and helping supporting, the link is here. It's appended to the top of the comment section. You can help support us and doing what we're doing here at Myth Vision Podcast. So, no further ado, welcome, gentlemen, to Myth Vision Podcast. How are you?
Yeah, it's going well. It's I think it's a beautiful day here in San Antonio. So enjoying I think it's the 80-degree weather after we just had about 32 degrees the last couple of days. So weather is finally back to its normal conditions. So we're loving it down here.
Is it snowing for you, Dr. Collins?
No, we don't have snow. There was a possibility of snow today. It was very mild last week, and then the temperature just dropped on Monday.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it just dropped 2 days ago for us. It was 73 in North Carolina. Now I can't walk out with my T-shirt on anymore. So, all right, I wanted to start us out, if I may, Jonathan Sheffield. What got you into the book of Daniel? Like, who were inspirations and people you look up to? And tell us your observations of it, if you don't mind. And then from there, I'd like to have Dr. Collins, with his expertise, give his insights, his thoughts, maybe his criticisms, his praises, etc., if he has any. And don't forget the books. I feel pretty honored with this one. This looks like typewriter material, Dr. Collins' books and stuff. Mm-hmm. So I'm bragging a little bit here. Yep. But Sheffield, tell us, if you don't mind, start us out.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Collins, for joining us. And thanks again, Derek, for hosting this conversation with someone that I truly admire and really appreciate his work on the subject. I think for me, and I think for people that know me, I've done a lot of work in New Testament textual criticism, the canon of the New Testament. So stepping into Daniel was a little different for me, really starting engaging with some of the Old Testament literature that I really got interested with. For me, my interest in the book of Daniel really first began after I started reading the once Russian Marxist philosopher Nikolai Berdyaev's. He has his work, The Meaning of History. And I think, for an Anglican myself, we can definitely appreciate the work of the Russian Orthodox Church. And I definitely, appreciate his work. And I think one of the observations from Berdyaev's work was that Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream represented the first attempt in the history of mankind to kind of attribute a design to history. And I was like, wow, that's an interesting thought right there. And it's in this idea that Berdyaev discusses that we're kind of made to feel as a people that we're kind of engaged in a process that tends towards a definite goal. And I think for someone like myself, this is something that I can relate to. And I think even more, Berdyaev kind of pointed out how we get a glimpse of how the Jews actually conceived the world. For them, it was more about historical fulfillment instead of the Greek view of a kind of finite cyclic process that they looked at history. So it really opened me up to a different perspective, especially how the ancients viewed the world. And when you think about many people in the Christian community getting into the study of the book of Daniel, I think a lot of people that I've been associated with, come to that discussion with an eye on the prophecies. And what I liked about Berdyaev is he was actually more interested in that the book of Daniel actually dealt with the catastrophic events in the destiny of the Jewish people. For him, that was more of an area of interest that I started to kind of get interested in as well. And if you think about it, from Berdyaev's perspective, he started off not in the Russian Orthodox Church, but he was a member of the real left, in Marxism. Those ideas contributed to the Russian Revolution. And so he approached, matters of histories, from a materialistic interpretation. So, when he decided early in his life to kind of verify Marx's, economic materialism by applying it to the destinies of people, it kind of broke down for him in the case of the Jews, and he ultimately came to the conclusion that, he kind of looked at the Jewish people's survival as kind of mysterious and a kind of really cool phenomenon that he couldn't explain from, the upbringing in his Marxist viewpoint. And what strikes me the most about Berdyaev is this is the reason why he left Marxism and joined eventually the Russian Orthodox Church. And it made me wonder what stood out from the Jewish history that led Berdyaev, a man ingrained in this Marxist worldview, to this decision. I was like, someone of that nature, what does it take? And then I started reading on more, and I saw Berdyaev's idea in his understanding of the book of Daniel when I started reading the writings of Mark Twain, who, for me, reading all his works was not only a hero of mine, but he's someone who I felt really contributed great insights into the human condition. I think for me, I think Twain really captured the mindset of Americans after the Civil War. I think he captured it really well. He taught us in Huck Finn, how we can look at Jim as a human instead of property. And he also, his travel log on The Innocents Abroad showed us what probably some people think today, that most Americans have no understanding of the world outside the U.S. So I always looked at him as a great thinker. So when Mark Twain, really commented about the Jews, and he made the statement that all things are mortal but the Jew, it seemed evident from his writings that he looked out in history and saw the great empire of the Egyptians, Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and realized that those empires kind of came and gone. And in contrast, he kind of saw in the small population of the Jewish people who not only saw these empires but interacted with them. He felt they beat them all, and he's the one that's kind of left standing today. And while Twain couldn't really explain the survival of the Jews from a naturalistic perspective, it did leave him to wonder what is their secret, or what set of circumstances led to this, which really got me even more interested in my study of Daniel. And I thought, okay, well, this is actually a great question, and maybe another area that we can explore in my studies of Daniel. So I thought, let me have the goal of trying to determine, what conditions may have existed that contributed to the longevity for the Jewish people in the context of my study on Daniel. And I think what I wanted to do is kind of step a little away from my Anglican background, even though I feel we have a very rich empirical tradition, but really look at it like I look at it every day for work. And I think some things that people don't know about me is that over the last 20 years, I've been in the field of data science and programming. And, my job is specifically to extract meaning and insights from millions of rows of structured and unstructured data, and then share that knowledge with executive management to make better informed. So when I thought about the book of Daniel, for me, it basically represented one product, a writing among a suite of products with all these other writings that are common to the Jewish people. And then, I thought about, how do I look at products today? Well, I look at it and we can understand its acquisition, the value of those products for the members, which in this case would be the Jewish people, and the type of products that typically don't appeal to a specific member base. And I thought, okay, well, if we're looking at the Jewish people in this case, which kind of represents our key demographic, I wanted to look at the survival element of the Jewish people as it kind of represents the tenure of a member segment that has been able to kind of navigate successfully in volatile economic conditions. And I think one of the things that I saw is that when we plot out the history of the Jewish people, and if we look at 721 to 1948, I noticed several key trends that could possibly add a lot of value in our discussion of the book of Daniel. Now, I think the first thing I notice is that there's this uninterrupted series of conquests against the state of Judea, in which the Jews were considered at some point an enemy to the respective empire and power. And then I noticed that its ancestral capital, Jerusalem, was either captured, attacked, or destroyed on or about 16 times in this span of history. And then I noticed, in terms of the suite of products in the Orthodox Jews' portfolio, I noticed that it didn't grow, even though out there on the market, when we look at the Hellenistic period, they were kind of flooded with new product offerings in the terms of additional writings that I thought would have had some intrinsic value to the Orthodox Jews. And so,
Jonathan, just so you know, we're about to run out of that 10-minute time here, and I do want to get it to Dr. Collins to get back and forth. Just a heads up, I do want to let everyone know, and there's some fanboys in the chat, of course, that would love. Dr. Kip Davis is like, Dr. John J. Collins, are you kidding? The legend, Dude, I want to try and put something together with him in the future too. So, but yeah, finish up what you're saying so the conversation with you and him can actually open up.
Okay, no, that sounds great. So, and then, lastly, I kind of looked at two significant anomalies in the data set. And when we look at the reign of probably the two greatest conquerors in and around the area of Judah, with Cyrus and Alexander Great, we see something different for the Jews. The way of life of the theocracy was kind of left unmolested as a religious community. There was no conquest of Jerusalem or occupation. And I thought about the kind of political reality that pervades the situation in Carl Schmitt's friend and enemy distinction, that the rulers must decide on in a state of exception. So, from the worldview of Cyrus and Alexander, not only would the people would factor in, but also their gods as well. And it got me to thinking, in most cases, the Jews were the enemy. So suddenly, all of a sudden, how did the Jews and their God become the friends under these two empires? And I'll finish off with the point that what we see in a lot of the data that's out there surrounding the discussion of Daniel is there seems to be data which would help explain this kind of blossoming relationship from the standpoint of these great leaders that would then maybe start to ask some questions regarding how do we look at the dating of Daniel and regarding some of its authenticity.
You got to hear Jonathan's side, and I know that was long-winded, Dr. Collins, and we apologize. We do apologize, but you got a lot to take in there, and we want to hear your personal thoughts.
But I'm afraid it's a long time since I looked at Berdiev, or even at Mark Twain, for that of it. But let me just pick up on the idea of history having a goal. Now, actually, this was kind of a hot topic in academics about 50 years ago when I was getting into this field, and then it faded completely from discussion for a long time. Maybe it's time for it to come back. I would say that most of the Old Testament actually presupposes that there is a goal. You know, in the early part of maybe not for all of history, although probably, you know, but in the early part, the goal is to get Israel into the promised land. And then later on, it's that all other people come and worship in Jerusalem and say how great they are. So, you know, that on a fairly simple level, that's fairly endemic to the whole Hebrew Bible. It's not altogether unique to the Hebrew Bible. Now, what's novel in Daniel, in a way, is the idea of total history. You know, that it's not just talking about the history of one people, it's trying to comprehend all peoples and the whole span of history. Now, it may not quite be that, but that's what they're aiming at. And actually, some of the most interesting work done on this in recent years is by a man in classics at Harvard named Paul Cosman, who wants to claim that this was due to the Seleucid ideology. You know, the Seleucid kings were the first ones to introduce a Seleucid chronology. So instead of starting over with every king, you date the whole thing from the beginning of the first of them. Now, I don't know if what's cause and what's effect there. These were both, I think, products of the Hellenistic period. I think one of Alexander was different from Cyrus or anybody else before him. And what he introduced was a much wider kind of cosmopolis. And it is in that period then that you begin to get people thinking about the totality of time, the totality of space. And that's a big factor in what we call the apocalyptic literature, not only Daniel, but also in some of the books of Enoch, where, you know, you can predict the whole course of history. Enoch could do it before the flood. So the idea is everything is already mapped out. So that's one thing there. But the other thing I would like to say about Daniel is that you've always got to bear in mind, this is a book that was written in a very particular time and place. And we know, at least when the latter part of the book of Daniel was written, more accurately than almost any other book. Because, and the pagan philosopher Porphyry pointed this out, 2,000 years ago, that in Daniel chapter 11, he gets everything right down until the death of Antiochus. How did he manage to get all of that right? Because it had already happened. And when he actually moves to the future, things don't actually work out quite the same way. Now, this is part of a literary convention. I'm not trying to debunk the book of Daniel by saying that, but it does draw attention to the fact this is a response to what we usually think of as a persecution, an attempt, actually, I think, to suppress the distinctive identity of the Judeans in Jerusalem. And it's a response against that. And so, I would be a little bit wary of making it into a general philosophy of history. It's a response to a particular situation, although it certainly has ramifications, that we could talk about.
Real quick, gentlemen, if I may, I have a few super chats. I'd like to maybe pop them up as we carry on the conversation to keep the conversation lively. And of course, to hear both of you guys say what you'd like. Thank you, Avaros. I hope I'm saying that correct for the super chat. And Doc Pleroma has his super chat question. Many attribute, by the way, there's an audience, Dr. Collins. I didn't know if I mentioned that. There's right now we only have 162 people. But
we always hope there's an audience. But most of the time, we don't see it.
Exactly. Doc Pleroma says,
for doubt.
He said, many attribute the obvious historical errors to naivete. I find that the author generally knew what he was doing and salted their inspirational novels with blatant anachronism as a literary device. What say you?
It's very hard to say how much they knew. I don't think people in Judea around 200 BC knew much of the history of the Persian Empire, for example. They knew there had been a Persian Empire, but I don't think they knew very much about it. I don't think they knew how many kings there had been, how many years had passed since the Babylonian exile. Now, at the same time, I think whoever wrote Daniel 11 knew a lot. So much so that some people think he must have had a source describing the Hellenistic wars, because a lot of that stuff is quite detailed. Now, when he trumps up Darius the Mede, now, as far as we can tell, there was no such person. But you see, he serves a purpose in the book of Daniel because Daniel wants to lay it out as 4 kingdoms, and he needs to get Media in there. Now, so that's serving a purpose. Did the author know that there was no Darius the Mede? Hard to say. We don't really know. He may very well have known. He may very well. I'm sure there's a certain amount of poetic license. And some of it, in fact, has a little touch of humor. Like when Nebuchadnezzar is turned into a beast. This isn't just naivete. This is mischievous naivete, if you like. And the same, the king, in many of those stories in the first part of Daniel, the king is made to look ridiculous. And that's deliberate. So, I think probably somewhere in between, not as naive as some people think he was, but not necessarily fully informed either, because they just didn't have the resources to be fully informed, I think.
Jonathan, what are your thoughts?
It's hard to identify with an author that we probably don't have that much information on. I think what we see in Porphyry related through Jerome is he identifies a figure with sort of no name around the general area. So it's hard to see what his influences are, as opposed to someone like Jerome. We have a lot of history on him. We have a lot of correspondence. You get a little more insight into why Jerome may have taken an approach on the Vulgate that he did, because we have a lot of supplemental information from Jerome, people that went to visit him, correspondence with him and Augustine, that gives us insight into his thinking process on why he went with particular readings, why he took stances on certain books that we don't have in this situation, which makes it more difficult to kind of arrive at any conclusion what some scribe or author may have done and what his influences are in creating this text.
Thank you. I got one more, if that's okay with you guys. Super chat here. Aaron, thank you for the super chat. What's the evidence that Antiochus did not die in Israel? Could you please also discuss the origin of angels like Michael, heaven reflecting earth?
Well, the evidence that Antiochus did not die in Israel is in a Babylonian chronicle. And it's also in Greek authors. So that's pretty well attested, that he died over in the east in Parthia. I don't think that's at all in dispute. Now, as to the origin of angels like Michael, Michael makes his debut in the Bible in the book of Daniel. He had probably been known for a while, because he also comes up in parts of the book of Enoch that are probably older than Daniel. Now, in the early parts of the Hebrew Bible, you have the prince of the army of the Lord. In the book of Joshua, for example, Joshua is confronted by this figure who introduces himself as the prince of the army of the Lord. But it's only in the Hellenistic period that those figures are given names. Now, what you had in the earlier period, first of all, most of the Bible, most of the Hebrew Bible, is not monotheistic in a strict sense. It is assumed that there are lots of gods. Now, what is a god? A god is a spiritual being who doesn't die. And, in the pagan religions, there's no problem in having a multitude of gods. In the Hebrew Bible, too, I think they allow that the other nations have their gods. They're just not real gods. They're not gods on a par with the Most High. And the Most High always has a whole host around him. It's never thought that he was up there on his own. But it's only in the Hellenistic period that they begin to give those figures names, and you find a lot of them named in the book of Enoch. You have Gabriel also in Daniel, Sariel, Uriel, and so forth. Why at this particular point? Well, part of it is that they're being downgraded in a way. They're not gods, although they can sometimes be called gods in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But they're given identities as, if you like, minor deities, but definitely subordinate to the Most High. I'm not sure that answers your question, but that's something.
Oh, I think you're on mute, Derek.
Sorry, it looks like a diachronic approach is, this evolution of thought, maybe as they're devolving from something higher, maybe down. But
Yeah.
Jonathan, I'm sorry, we had to get these super chats when they pop up. I'll try to. This is your discussion with Dr. Collins, so please don't mind me if you want to get your 2 cents out. I just wanted to let the audience be able to interact with Q&A and throw out super chats that way. So, but yeah, go ahead, Jonathan.
No. Oh yeah, no worries at all. I think one of my questions for you, Dr. Collins, and it's for me just trying to understand, some of my observations, and I think one of the things that we see during the Hellenistic time period is a number of writings that start to come out. I mean, even supposedly with Daniel, but there's a lot of apocryphal literature that comes out, and we find a lot of this in the Septuagint. So in the Septuagint, we see these documents. So it made me wonder, when we look at the Orthodox Jewish canon, why, if anything, if they were going to add something to their canon during this period, which they kind of felt that God stopped talking to them or wasn't inspiring them anymore, why would they add a book like Daniel of an interpreter of dreams instead of something like the Maccabees, something that kind of shows their epic struggle against the Seleucid Empire that was probably their biggest and most important military campaign since the time of David? Why not add that if you're going to add anything that they celebrate every year?
There are many Jews who would ask that question too. There would be a new commentary now coming out in the Anchor series by Danny Schwartz, who teaches at the Hebrew University. And I think Danny's sympathies are very much with the Maccabees more than with Daniel. But these actually, were two different options in the Judaism of the time. Because confronted with the actions of Antiochus Epiphanes, when he, tried to, as he saw it, put down a revolt in Jerusalem and then abolish the traditional Jewish cult. What do you do about it? And so on the one hand, you have the solution of the Maccabees. Get yourself a sword. Some of the Judas Maccabee and his friends had probably gone to the gymnasium that Jason had set up in Jerusalem. And, they did a great job. But on the other hand, you had people who said, no, that will get you into fighting on the Sabbath, which is breaking the law. And the Maccabees said, to hell with that, in effect. It's better break one commandment and be alive to keep the rest of them than get yourself wiped out. But these are two starkly different options. Now, the intriguing thing is that it's the Daniel one that got into the canon eventually, which leaves us with the question, who were the people who decided? And in the long run, I think decisions weren't really made until after the fall of Jerusalem. And partly for that, but already even in their own time, there were people who did not like the Maccabees and who thought this isn't the real thing. These people take too many liberties with the law, and so marginalize them. And I think you would probably have to figure that it was the Pharisees and their followers among the rabbis, who finally decided what was in and what was out. And they kept Daniel. In a way, Daniel is unverifiable. The things that are verifiable in the book of Daniel didn't actually happen, but nobody seems to have been too bothered by that, because you could still affirm, the sovereignty of God and the idea that ultimately you'll be vindicated. So they kept that. But I think many of them would have felt that it was the attitude of the Maccabees that finally got them into trouble with Rome. And one of the things they were reacting against when they finalized the official collection of writings was the crushing defeat at the hands of Rome. And this was carried out by people who were zealots. This is also said in First Maccabees that they were zealous for the law, like Phinehas in the Hebrew Bible. And I think some of the Pharisees and people like them thought, that's where trouble lies. But I think it's an extraordinary thing, because you would expect that it's the Jews who would keep First Maccabees, and instead the Christians kept it. It had a certain currency by the time.
So, Jonathan, just a heads up, we have many super chats when you're ready to open up that. So go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, I'll ask another question, and then you can go to a super chat. Those will be fun. Dr. Collins, I think one of the things that myself as a Christian recognizes, and I think you pointed out in your works, is the problem of historical reference of characters in the book of Daniel that we can't reference outside, and obviously I can understand that being an issue. Now, but how do we then take the information? While I have probably one of the utmost respect for Porphyry and in the works that he composed, and how do we square that outside of Porphyry, there's no historical reference for the book of Daniel being a byproduct of that era anywhere in either the Jewish literature, from the Secluded Empire, Rome, all these scholars going around. And I would say personally, Porphyry, who is from the general area, in Tyre, would probably have access to some pretty good information from the time. So I'm not trying to doubt it, but why don't we see it elsewhere? Like if I wanted to understand probably more about the Homeric text, we can see historical references that point back to Pisistratus, in the 6th century by a number of different people, which shows some sort of historical reference out of just one person. So how do we, at least in the academy, look at that?
Well, one way of looking at it is to ask, when do we get anything about the book of Daniel outside of the book itself? When do we get allusions to it? Now, the earliest allusions to it are in First Maccabees, actually, with the abomination of desolation, and in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But now, that brings you down probably to 100 BC or later. Nowhere now, as you go through the book of Daniel, you can see allusions to Ezekiel. You don't find allusions to Daniel in any other book of the Hebrew Bible. Even Ben Sira, who wrote probably at the beginning of the 2nd century and lists all the heroes of the Old Testament, no Daniel. Now, he's missing one or two others as well, but still, there is no evidence for Daniel before that time. What's more puzzling is, did everybody just believe this? And, they seem to have. Now, there may have been people who said this stuff is nonsense and just brushed it aside. But you don't get anybody arguing against it, until Christianity becomes a force that has to be reckoned with and engaged, which is what happens with Porphyry. It's not only Daniel. You also have the writings of Enoch. Now, the first person who disputes the authenticity of the Enoch writings, as far as I know, is Tertullian. And when he does, it's because he doesn't like what it says. It's not the kind of argument that Porphyry makes. It's not saying, how could Enoch possibly have known that? How could his writings have survived the flood? It's because he just doesn't like some of the stuff that Enoch says. So, I figure people must have been a bit more credulous in the ancient world. But look, I shouldn't say that. Look at the stuff people believe nowadays.
Yes.
You can write the craziest thing and put it on the internet, and you'll get people who'll believe it.
Yeah, the majority of people believe it, yes.
We shouldn't be too dismissive of the credulity of the ancients. Might even be a couple of those down in North Carolina, Derek.
Oh, there's definitely a couple down here. Some might even be my family members. Anyway, thank you so much. We'll get these super chats, try and chip away at them if that's okay. Jonathan, if you need to butt in, man, just let me know. Aaron, what do Orthodox Jews say about the origin of the book? I think they would say, most of all, that they would agree and believe that it was written by a man in the 6th century BC, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
I think some would and some wouldn't.
Okay.
I would hesitate to speak for any group of Jews.
Right.
You very seldom find two who agree. Now, I know some Orthodox Jews who are quite scholarly, and know what's up and what's down. But I imagine, that there is what we would kind of regard as fundamentalists, people who would just accept it and not ask any questions about it. But in that respect, it's not so much different from Christians.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That is well put. Avaros is back. Thank you. And I think you wrote your question on a separate one because it was long. What is the beginning date of Daniel 9:25? Is it 586 BC with Cyrus? If so, then does not Daniel's timeline of 483, 63 weeks of years, ends in 103 BC with the death of Aristobulus the first king?
Well, I think any way you look at it, the 70 weeks of years is too long for the period between the Babylonian exile and the time of the Maccabees. I take that as evidence that Daniel didn't actually know, or the author of Daniel didn't actually know how much time had passed. So I mean, it doesn't matter too much exactly where you begin it in 925. Well, the rebuilding of Jerusalem, in any case, that would be not 586, but actually 539. So even later, which would then push it down later again. But the fact remains that when Daniel is talking or predicting the history, he doesn't go beyond the lifetime of Antiochus Epiphanes.
Thank you. Jonathan, did you want to make a comment and then continue, or you want me to continue? And
either or, if you have another question.
Yeah, I have another one. Scholarvid. Thank you, Scholarvid. And it's to Dr. Collins. And if you have anything in particular, Jonathan, that you want to add in, feel free. Dr. Collins, is there any evidence of literary dependency between the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel?
Plenty. Revelation is very obviously influenced by Daniel and modeled on it. Beasts coming up out of the sea. Where else do you get them? And the figure of the Son of Man. So, yeah, I mean, there's plenty of evidence.
I think Jonathan totally agrees.
I believe it is G.K. Beale wrote a book on that and the use of Daniel in Revelation.
Yeah, I got
some. Yeah. Obviously, there's similarities when you look at Revelation. I think it makes it probably more enticing when you start looking at both what was produced, under the Christians and obviously with the Jews, and to see these similarity, especially in ideas and imagery, come out, which kind of adds to the interest in this discussion. So,
yeah.
Thank you, gentlemen. MJT532, did a later king fulfill the events in late chapter 11?
No. Quite simply, no. I mean, that there is no foreign ruler who comes in and gets killed between the sea and the holy mountain. Who would that be? Even in the Left Behind series, I don't think
they don't even cover it.
Yeah.
Wow. Did you want to comment on that, Jonathan, or move on?
No, we can move on from that question.
Awesome. Aram Guard, thank you for the super chat. Can Dr. Collins elaborate on Michael as Daniel's son of man and what the role entails? And an alternative view from Jonathan is welcome as well. Thank you for including Jonathan in this as well. Thank you, Aram Guard.
Now, as any of you who have done any reading on the book of Daniel know that one of the great disputed questions is the identity of the one like a son of man in chapter 7. And for a long time, there was the standard scholarly view was that was just a personification of the people of Israel. And I disagree with that. I've written an awful lot on this. The holy ones of the Most High aren't just ordinary Jews. They're the angelic patrons of the Jews. Now, so that you haven't, somebody I think had mentioned this in one of the earlier chat questions, and I didn't quite get around to it. But the premise of the book of Daniel is that what happens on earth is a reflection of something that's happening in heaven or on the supernatural level. You think this is a fight between Greeks and Jews. Actually, it's a fight between the Prince of Greece and the Prince of Israel. And Michael is the Prince of Israel. And what it says in Daniel 7 then is that this Prince of Israel, who is described really in theophanic language, meaning that it's the kind of language that's used to describe the appearance of a god riding on the clouds of heaven, that he will eventually be lifted up and awarded the victory. That's what it's saying. So now, is that there's the existing commentary in the Anchor Bible series, of which I am now the editor, is something of an embarrassment. Because Alex Dilella, who's the man who wrote it, said, what meaning would that have for the Jews? But this, I think, is just a failure of any mythological imagination. We, by and large, most of us, don't believe in angels and demons. But these people did. And if you take that seriously, it's enormously meaningful, because it means that even if you seem to be losing the battle, even if Antiochus Epiphanes is getting away with murder, you can still believe that you have a heavenly patron who will come to your aid. And that's what Daniel is affirming. That's why Daniel says you don't need to join the Maccabees. You don't need to get your hands dirty that way. What you need to do is keep the law, believe, and that way you'll be vindicated.
Jonathan?
Yeah, and and I'll just honestly admit, obviously, my views from an Anglican upbringing is probably going to stain my views a little bit, because when we look at the Old Testament, we obviously understand it in a view that it prophesizes the future Messiah, and the speaking, it's a foreshadow of things to come. Taking from Paul, and obviously there's different debate on this particular issue for myself, and with my upbringing, and I hear what Dr. Collins is saying, from my perspective, and it's largely based on my influence and my upbringing, is that we would identify that with the Messiah. So that's how we would interpret it from that standpoint.
Yeah. Let me just say something in general about the typological understanding of the Old Testament, which I think is very much cherished in the Anglican tradition.
Mm-hmm.
You get some of it in the Catholic tradition too. Now, my point here would be, these texts must have meant something to the people of the time. So nobody who read or heard the book of Daniel, chapter 7, could say, oh, Jesus must be going to come. Because this was 200 years before Jesus. Nobody had any concept of somebody like Jesus. Was it they could conceivably have thought the Messiah is going to come? But then it's remarkable that you don't get the Messiah at all, really, in the book of Daniel. Otherwise, you have the word Mashiach is used twice in Daniel 9. One time it's referring to Joshua, the high priest, after the Babylonian exile, and the other time it's referring to Onias III, a high priest who was killed. But there is no, human or quasi-human Messiah who is expected to come to achieve the victory. So, that this would be my argument, that where you have it clearly stated, which it is in chapters 10 through 12, the Prince of Israel is Michael. And he is a being of the same order as Gabriel and other holy ones. And, that's the upstairs level.
Thank you. Thank you. Avaros, thank you for the super chat. You're figuring out how to do it, you said. MJ said, does the Aramaic or Hebrew help us date Daniel?
Yes, but it's not that clear. Actually, the argument is more whether the Aramaic of the book of Ezra helps us date that. And I think it does. But I think if you compare the Aramaic in Ezra and in Daniel, you can see that Ezra has an earlier form of Aramaic than Daniel. Now, I mean, these are relatively fine points, but I think that is quite demonstrable. What's more difficult then is when you compare the Aramaic of Daniel and the Hebrew of Daniel with the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were perhaps written 100 years later or thereabouts. And they're not identical, but Daniel, I think, is closer to the Dead Sea Scrolls than it is to Ezra. I'd put it that way. The Hebrew of the second half of Daniel is not good Hebrew. You know, it's not fluent the way classical biblical Hebrew is. And there's a scholar at the Jewish Theological Seminary, H.L. Ginsberg, who thought that it had been retroverted from Aramaic. You know, that it was all written in Aramaic, and this was translation Hebrew, so to speak. I don't think so, but I think it was written by people for whom Hebrew wasn't their first language, probably.
Thank you so much. And thank you once again, Averos, for figuring out how to do this. Jack Straw. And let me know, Jonathan. I'm writing you in the private chat just to be sure, because I'm not going to interrupt people. Let me know when you need to interject. I don't want to be running all over you here. Jack Straw.
I think, having Dr. Collins join us is obviously not for me, but for the audience as well, so we can share, his feedback on these issues. So, maybe after the next question.
Just jump in. What is one like the Son of Man meant to convey? Thank you for that super chat.
Well, you see, in Daniel chapter 7, he sees 4 beasts coming up out of the sea, and he describes these beasts, and they're all like some mixture of birds and animals and the like. And then the last one is like a son of man just means a human being. And notice it doesn't say, and then a son of man appears. It's one like a son of man. So it's a figure that looks like a human being. And I think in this kind of literature, when you say that a figure is like something, you can safely enough assume that it isn't actually that. This is meant to describe how it appears in a vision. What it's like, yeah. So that language is used here for the contrast with the animals. Incidentally, in chapter 8, the chapter 8 is in Hebrew, chapter 7 is in Aramaic, but Gabriel is said to have the appearance of a man. It's a different term. It's Gever rather than Enoch or Adam. But it's the same idea, that Gabriel also is one like a son of man.
Awesome. You want me to get the next question, Jonathan?
Yeah, no, I'll go chime in. Or
Apocalypse here. Thank you for the super chat. Jumping forward to the New Testament's appropriation of Daniel material. What do you think Mark thinks the abomination of desolation refers to?
Well, this now would be a question for my wife, if you ever get her on. But without asserting myself too much on it, I would think it's probably the Roman standards in Jerusalem. Now, it's not fully clear. It's something, I think, that the Romans brought into Jerusalem. But now whether there's some kind of image involved, but I would think it's probably just Roman standards, and that was an abomination to have those in the place of the temple.
That's interesting to think about. Thank you so much. Aaron, are Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian years 586 BC, etc., rock solid, or could these ever go upside down? Sometimes kings seem to have restarted counting.
I mean, the modern chronology is pretty certain. And, we arrive at that by comparing different accounts. So you know which king was contemporary with some king somewhere else. So I think, the date of 586 for the destruction of Jerusalem, that's pretty solid. And the date of the defeat of the Babylonians by the Persians, those are pretty solid.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Okay. I guess this next question, just get my thinking going a little bit. When we consider the question of Daniel, for me, I think it's important to look at any and all data that we have surrounding the book of Daniel. And I think what's quite interesting is for Josephus. First, I think Josephus is the perfect person just because he occupied a unique role under the Flavian emperors, in the sense that the situation that brought him there into standing at the Roman court was, he sort of prophesized. Now, I definitely can see Vespasian, wanting to use something like this to his advantage, not obviously believing that he's the prophet, but something he can do as a non-July to come into power at Rome, especially after, there's been 3 emperors. They're setting up the Colosseum. Let's get the people on our side. Let's get the Jews on their side. And he's the only kind of Jewish general that kind of survives the whole ordeal. And so it does make it interesting in looking into the worldview of someone like Vespasian. And then we find in Josephus, not one, but 2 accounts where, from the Jewish transaction side, that the works of both Daniel and the works of Isaiah were presenting to these 2 kings, 2 conquerors. And then we see
Cyrus and Alexander the Great.
Cyrus and Alexandria. And then we see all this kind of unique blossoming relationship in terms of economic standing, privilege for the Jews. And then when I look at Arian, and while I get he's under Hadrian, it's not a good time to be writing anything nice about the Jews, given what Hadrian had to deal with the Bar Kokhba. But he does at least confirm that the Palestine or the nation or Israel did come to terms with Alexander. Now, he doesn't go into any more details, which I presume he doesn't want to embarrass Hadrian, and neither someone like Plutarch. But this is published in Josephus, a fellow court, historian. Is the non-response from someone like Arian and Plutarch sort of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the dog that didn't bark? So they're familiar with this. But I just want to get your thoughts on that idea. I know there was a lot to kind of take in.
Sometimes the dog doesn't bark because there's nothing worth barking about. Mm-hmm. And do we know of any cases where people reacted to Josephus?
Well, he was doing more of the responses. It's kind of interesting when we look at someone like Josephus or Jerome or even the Christians. It seems like we get a lot of their pushback on the claim. So like Origen with Celsus, we see someone like Josephus is responding to Apian and some of the other Egyptian priests. Now, the one thing I would say at that time frame that did kind of question is Philo of Byblos did attack a piece of work that we do find in Josephus regarding the Jews that served in Alexander's army, and he claimed it to be a piece of Jewish propaganda of, from a writing attributed to Hecataeus. So we do see at the time of Hadrian someone attacks a work that was published in Josephus' work. Now, he doesn't say he's attacking Josephus per se, but it's a writing that could be under dispute from Hecataeus that shows that they were willing to attack what they felt was Jewish propaganda.
Yeah, but very little. There's very little Greek or Roman response to the Jewish propaganda, and my impression is that most of the time they just ignored it.
Thank you. You mind if I jump into these questions? We got some chat.
No, definitely.
And just keep in mind, I'm private chatting you, Jonathan, just to make sure we're coordinating here.
Anyway, Jonathan, I was figuring we were just going an hour.
Can we wrap these with a couple questions, Dr. Collins?
We can wrap with a couple of questions, yeah, but we'll need to wait to wrap it up because.
Okay.
Oh, definitely. Once again, thank you for your time, Dr. Collins.
Absolutely. So did some interpret Daniel 9 as having a first century Messiah?
There's a whole Christian literature that wanted to make the prophecies of Daniel fit Jesus. Daniel 9 has a huge history of interpretation. And one part of it was trying to work it out so that it will fit Jesus. And the Greek is a little bit different from the Hebrew. And then the second thing in it is trying to calculate the end of the world. And that brings us right down to the beginning of this century. Actually, the people have been doing that.
Thank you. Topic discussed said, this is Mormonism's view on Michael in the book of Daniel. Daniel in his 7th chapter speaks of the Ancient of Days. He means the oldest man, our father Adam, Michael, Joseph Smith, I think. That's Joseph Smith's interpretation.
What is the relationship there between Adam and Michael in that sentence?
I think he thinks Michael. It seems to me it's saying the oldest man
is
is Adam, which is Michael. Yeah. Joseph Smith, he had a seer stone, so you can't argue against that. He. No, I'm just teasing.
I know. This is a case where the dog shouldn't bark.
Oh, that's funny. Lucas Hunt, thank you for the super chat. Daniel quotes Jeremiah. Jeremiah says the Lord will put his throne in Elam. Daniel prophesies from Susa, Elam. Antiochus did die after attacking the temple in Susa, Elam. Was Daniel 11 about Susa?
I don't think there's any way you can read Daniel 11 as implying, what it says about the death of Antiochus is between the sea and the holy mountain. Can't get Susa, Elam into that. Elam is Persia. That's considerably to the east.
Wow. Thank you. Let me do a short outro here because I didn't know we were going to end so soon, but I know Dr. Collins, I know you quite well, my friend, and I do appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming on and hanging out with me and Jonathan. I'd hope that we can do this again in the future. Expert on Daniel, go get the books. Endless material. I'm not kidding. I read his Apocalyptic Imagination, his commentary on Daniel, and his introduction to the Hebrew Bible, the 3rd edition, which I got a copy right here, a big fat. You got a couple different versions. I was going to ask you, what's up with the thick one? This one's really, really thick. Then you got a little bit thinner, and then you got a really thin one. What are the different versions?
Well, there is a short introduction, which is just an abbreviation of the long one. And then after the 3rd edition came out, the publisher put it out in fascicles. So you could get the introduction to the Pentateuch, the introduction to the prophets, the introduction to the writings, that kind of thing.
Well,
but it's the same material.
I hope everybody get a copy. I've got some signed copies too. So when Dr.
I even got Dr. Collins' book on Daniel, which is really good. Your work did come very highly recommended, Dr. Collins. Everyone that I spoke to, whether it was Dr. Jim Majors or Dr. Richard Carrier. A number of scholars in the field all recommended your work to get a really good overview of your scholarship on Daniel. So
I must admit, this image doesn't look like you, though, right here on Amazon. And also
not one like a Son of Man.
Not one like the Son of Man, and definitely not the Ancient of Days. Also, subscribe to Jonathan's YouTube channel, and don't forget to support us on Patreon. I just dropped the Shroud of Turin. Is it real? Well, we have an expert historian who kind of debunks that whole notion, and it is kind of a debunk video kind of documentary. I edited it pretty well. Go check that out. Help support us. Dr. Collins, thank you so much. Jonathan, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you again, Dr. Collins.
Bye.
Seriously, have a good one, Dr. Collins. All right, ladies and gentlemen, don't forget, as we leave, let me leave you with a chant. We are Myth Vision.